Segundo Velota Segura had been attempting to fight an extradition order that would have seen him stand trial in the United States for charges related to trafficking. His lawyer, Jamie Balagia, and private investigator Chuck Morgan hatched a plan that would have accomplished Segura's goal while padding their own pockets. Balagia and his accomplice teamed up to demand millions of dollars from Segura, who was behind bars in Bogota in 2015. They promised to use the money as bribes in America with the ultimate goal of getting rid of the U.S. charges against the defendant. After some negotiation, the lawyer and his client agreed on a total of $2 million in payments. However, Segura grew suspicious after paying roughly $1.5 million to Balagia and Morgan without seeing any results. He arranged for a hidden recording device to be placed in his cell. At one point, the inmate could be heard asking for the names of the U.S. officials who were supposed to be receiving the bribes. Said that he couldn't reveal too much and insisted that he was trying to keep Balagia very, very clean throughout the process. Although this explanation seemed to satisfy Segura at first, he later decided to present the FBI with evidence of his lawyer's financial shakedown. Many local attorneys advertise their services by adopting a unique persona or nickname. That's what Balagia did, portraying himself as the DWI Dude. Fans of The Big Lebowski might recognize the name as an homage to the cult classic's character, the Dude. With his laid-back, long-haired, larger-than-life appearance, Balagia even resembled the attributes of actor Jeff Bridges in that role. As for the DWI reference in the lawyer's nickname, he frequently took cases involving relatively minor charges of driving under the influence or possession of narcotics. Before passing the bar and representing clients in the courtroom, Balagia had carved out a career in law enforcement. He also mounted an unsuccessful bid to become the Texas Attorney General, running in 2014 as a Libertarian candidate. He quickly became a recognizable entity across the Lone Star State's hill country, mainly because of his in-your-face advertisements. He even procured an RV with bold outside decorations, including clear depictions of cannabis leaf. His catchphrase was unmistakable: "Busted? Call the dude." By 2015, however, he left those small fry cases in Texas and set out to represent a cartel associate in Bogota. Balagia contacted Bibiana Correa Perea, an attorney in Bogota who specialized in extradition cases. She initially reached out to Morgan, who had previously worked with authorities in the United States. Upon learning the details of the situation, Morgan suggested that Balagia might be able to help. Of course, all three individuals never tried to provide effective counsel, but instead wanted to make as much money as possible. In total, 3 suspected cartel members agreed to pay Balagia, Morgan, and Perea in hopes that they would escape extradition. After 2 defendants were sent from Columbia to Collin County, Texas, the only one left in Bogota was Segura. Balagia's effort to scam Segura was similar to his tactics against the other suspects, including Hermes Aliero Casanova Ordonez, who is commonly known as Megatron. He was still extradited to Texas, despite agreeing to pay the lawyers $700,000, but he only coughed up half the amount. Upon arriving in Collin County, Ordonez apparently expected that he would be released and his charges dropped. Instead, he found himself locked up with Balagia, insisting that he needed to pay even more money to get out of jail. Similarly, the scammers told Segura that he needed to come up with $1.2 million before demanding even more. His brother, Aldemar Valletta Segura, was also extradited to Texas. Balagia and his accomplices told him that he would need to pay another $1.2 million to ensure the case would disappear. Not satisfied with representing clients in the courtroom, Balagia decided in 2014 that he wanted to represent all Texans as the state's attorney general. Like his persona in the local ads and his namesake in The Big Lebowski, the Libertarians' campaign took on a unique life of its own. Much of his platform dealt with reforming the state's marijuana laws. The former cop also campaigned on a promise to bring about more accountability among the state's law enforcement officers. He courted a voting bloc that didn't seem to be represented by either the Republican or Democratic Party during that election cycle, and traveled the state accompanied by a theme song that was written to the tune of The Ballad of Davy Crockett. However, the effort wasn't enough to compete against GOP candidate Ken Morgan Paxton. It's worth noting that the DWI dude wasn't the only one in that race who would later face a criminal scandal. After winning the Attorney General race, Paxton was indicted on felony charges related to securities exchange fraud. By the time 2014 came to a close, the FBI was hot on the trail of Balajia's Colombian cartel scheme. Special Agent Jason Rennie testified that another agent was working undercover as the lawyer's bookkeeper. At one point, the FBI agent brought up the likelihood that any payments coming from Aledemar Segura would be from the proceeds of transporting illegal substances. In response, Balagia promised that there would be no issue taking money from the accused cartel members. As of September 2014, the FBI had been keeping tabs on Balagia's bank account, including a string of anonymous deposits totaling thousands of dollars at a time. Investigators determined that Perea had tasked some of her accomplices with making the transactions. According to the indictment, this wasn't the only way Balagia collected the bribe money. Authorities reported that he met with an individual known only as Coco in a parking lot to collect roughly $120,000 in cash. When confronted with this evidence, Balagia put forward the implausible defense that a random stranger simply decided to give him a six-figure gift outside of a shopping mall in Katy, Texas. Furthermore, his attorneys attempted to pass the buck by insisting that Morgan had orchestrated the entire scheme. The lawyers argue that Morgan had been working undercover with U.S. government officials. While Morgan had once been a federal informant, prosecutors in the case said there were no plans for him to work with American officials to accept bribes from the accused cartel members. So what was Morgan's role in the scam exactly? Given his prior experience working covertly with American government officials, Perea determined that he would be able to convince the Colombian suspects that they could see the charges against them dropped. Investigators identified Morgan as the private investigator responsible for introducing Balagia into the equation. Although he didn't speak Spanish, he reportedly spoke directly to the inmates through his wife. His conversations helped cement the case being compiled by the FBI after Segundo Segura produced the secret recordings. In effect, Morgan served as the middleman between Segura and Balagia, making it clear that he wanted to avoid any direct connection between the shakedown scheme and the DWI dude. Along with Pereira, Morgan pleaded guilty to his role in the scam. He was sentenced to 6 years behind bars, and Pereira received a 7-year sentence. When a criminal attempts to scam someone associated with a dangerous cartel, a criminal organization might not be the worst outcome imaginable. After all, these organizations have a reputation for shutting up their enemies for good. It seems clear that Segura or any of the suspects being targeted by Balagia could have reached out to their associates to deliver a message to get rid of the Texas lawyer. Instead, the Colombian inmate decided to take a less violent approach and simply report the scam to authorities in the United States. Instead of being taken out by cartel forces, Balagia squared off against the American justice system. He was charged with several conspiracy counts related to obstruction of justice, wire fraud, and money laundering. U.S. Attorney Joe Brown alluded to how lucky Balagia was to escape such a fate. Following the disgraced lawyer's indictment, Brown said the dude and his group were running a scam on dealers, some of the biggest dealers in the world. Brown added that it was fortunate for Balagia that these dealers chose to turn him over to the FBI rather than handle it any other way. Judge Brown wanted to make it clear that the American justice system isn't for sale and he'd prosecute anyone who felt otherwise. In 2019, the ex-police officer stood trial for 2 weeks in Texas Eastern County. The court heard that Balagia made false promises to the accused cartel members that their bribes could make the changes against them disappear. He described the payments he received as attorney's fees and attempted to place the lion's share of blame on Morgan. Furthermore, he pleaded ignorance about the charges against him. Specifically, his lawyers asserted that he had no idea that it was illegal to accept bags full of cash and bank deposits from anonymous shady figures. He even took the witness stand to testify that he didn't know such behavior could land him in trouble for money laundering. Even though his defense maintained that Morgan and Perea were the masterminds, he was merely a pawn in their scheme. The court disagreed, and he was convicted. Another part of his defense hinged on a plea for mercy from the court. Attorney Galen Riddles described his client as homeless, destitute, and broken, and calling for probation in the case. Acting U.S. Attorney Nicholas Gangel laid out the case against Balagia at the time. He said the evidence demonstrated that Balagia had been shaking down his clients for years by claiming that he was able to purchase favorable deals from prosecutors and judges alike. While Morgan and Perea received 6 and 7 years in federal prison respectively, a judge handed down a sentence for Balagia that was longer than both of those terms combined. He was ordered to be in prison for more than 15 years in connection to the scam that netted roughly $1.5 million total. Brown portrayed the case as an important reminder about the rule of law, explaining the Colombians and criminals in every country that we deal with need to understand things don't work that way in the United States. FBI Special Agent Matthew J. DeSarno celebrated the outcome, noting that the Bureau combats public corruption at all levels and will protect and defend the U.S. justice system for those who attempt to diminish its integrity. The 15-year sentence handed down by the court was a clear example of handling officials who misuse their influence for personal financial benefit. What are some of the scams that are done by the Mafia? Let's get right into it. Number 3, the world's worst gambler. MGM Grand, a casino based in Detroit, was declared not responsible for a gambler losing up to $6 million in investor funds at its tables. Gino Acatola, the gambler in question, was treated like royalty when he gambled at the MGM Grand. The casino extended extra lines of credit to him and gave him discounted rooms and even free meals. All of this made Acatola so comfortable that he went on to gamble away around $6 million. But the casino didn't just give him discounted rooms and extra lines of credit. They also waived the right to do a background check on Acatola. If they had, the MGM may have discovered that Acatola was gambling with investors' funds. They may have realized that Acatola had no other employment, no other sources of income, and was living large off the dime of others. They also may have discovered his criminal history involving identity theft and grand larceny. But since the MGM was both greedy and lazy, Acatola had everything he needed to lose millions. Before Acatola got into gambling away investors' funds, he was involved in petty crime, even having a stint in prison in the 1990s. His more recent criminal involvement was in 2013 when he pled guilty in a Macomb County court to fraud-related offenses, getting a 10-month suspended sentence for his efforts. But that didn't teach Acatola a lesson. Instead, he continued to commit all sorts of crimes. He eventually met his Waterloo when he got carried away and gambled all of his investors' funds. You might be wondering how Acatola got these investments in the first place. Well, Acatola was a skilled salesman who could convince many people to loan him money for his business. He promised abnormally high short-term returns and claimed the money invested would go into commercial construction projects in Michigan and Florida. But Acatola was lying. A lot of these projects didn't exist, and what he was actually doing was an elaborate ruse. To perpetuate his lies, he provided his would-be investors with fraudulent emails, contracts, and payout schedules concerning the projects. In the end, he was able to source around $6 million from investors. Our con man didn't just try his hands at defrauding investors. He also tried to defraud his friends too. Acatola owned about 5 tanning salons in Miami. His companies used Interlink, a middleman payment gateway, to process payments. He convinced his friend, who was the owner of Interlink, to raise the limit for his processing credit card refunds for an allegedly defective tanning product. This meant that Interlink would process refunds for that product, and the tanning locations would reimburse Interlink. However, the tanning businesses never repaid Interlink, and Acatola managed to scam them for about $200,000. Now that Acatola had all of this money he'd swindled, he had enough cash to spend on what he loved doing, which of course was gambling with someone else's money. Acatola's casino of choice was MGM Grand Detroit, where they treated him like complete royalty. Surprisingly, Acatola was an extremely bad blackjack player. One would expect a fraudster to be better at gambling. But Akatola was a complete exception to that rule. He lost money all day long, and MGM Grand encouraged him to continue playing. The casino gave him everything he needed: lines of credit, discounted rooms and meals, and whatever else to make him happy despite losing money. As his losses began to mount and MGM Grand continued to extend his credit, it reached a threshold where the casino was given permission to access to his background data. Because they extended him a long line of credit, they could legally check his background and see whether he was worthy of loaning to. But the MGM Grand did not check, and as such, didn't realize that he was gambling investors' funds away. Since Akatola was the worst gambler on the planet, MGM Casino might have had every reason not to check his background. One might even say they had every incentive to make sure he continued playing for as long as he could. In any case, Akatola was eventually arrested and charged in court for his crimes. But this didn't mark the end of his crime saga. Despite being found guilty, Akatola managed to convince the judge to sentence him to only a year in jail if he agreed to pay back a large portion of his loot. The proposed 1-year sentence was below the 6-year sentencing guidelines that the judge ought to have followed. So instead, the judge offered a reduced sentence if Akatola repaid $50,000, but Akatola couldn't even find money for that. The judge eventually just gave Akatola the 7-year sentence that was in the sentencing guidelines anyway. While his victims understood that Akatola's incarceration meant they would never see their money again, they were also glad that he was paying for his crimes. Was our con man ever remorseful? Not really. While he gave a short apology in court, his victim said he hadn't shown an ounce of remorse for his actions. Number 2. From Russia without love. Alex Gallant was an auto broker who used straw buyers to falsify financing applications and defraud local car dealers. Gallant's scheme was to obtain money from investors and financial institutions through false pretenses and then use the money however he wanted. Gallant took money from at least 40 victims, claiming that their money would be used to purchase and export luxury vehicles to China. Gallant also secured financing from financial institutions using fraudulent documents and straw borrowers who were working for Gallant's scheme behind the scenes. And he did all of this while on the run from the United States government and the Russian mob. If Gallant wasn't such a horrible fraudster, one might have been impressed by his ability to get on the bad side of the mafia and the law at the same time. He found himself in a situation where he could either accept up to 50 years of jail time with the US government or a nasty fate with the Russian mob. Which path did he take? Let's find out. Gallant was a man of many scams and schemes who loved to run his fraud through multiple channels so that he would have multiple fault lines. Gallant created a business called Timeless Auto Group to set up his scheme to recruit straw borrowers from around the country. These straw borrowers would visit dealerships that sold luxury cars like Range Rovers, Maseratis, Mercedes-Benz GLS 450s, and 550s. These dealerships would end up selling the luxury vehicles, and the straw borrowers would agree to a 6-year financing agreement with them. This agreement was usually brokered by a company called Ally Financial. The borrowers would turn the vehicle over to Gallant, who would have them shipped to buyers outside the country within a month. When Ally Financial discovered the scam, it had lost over $300,000 to Gallant's fraud. Here's where things get a little dicey. Ally Financial took the case to court, and it ended up being dismissed for unclear reasons. Aside from his straw buying operation, Gallant also managed to convince over 40 victims to invest in Timeless Auto Group. Unfortunately for those investors, Gallant didn't use the money to purchase vehicles. Instead, he turned the operation into an elaborate Ponzi scheme and used the money to support a lavish lifestyle. Gallant flew all over the country in private jets to engage in high-stakes betting at exclusive casinos. He also lived in a house he rented for $10,000 per month and paid professional gamblers to play for him, and then used whatever was left over of investors' funds to settle gambling debts that he had accumulated. This wasn't Gallant's first rodeo either. He had been previously convicted of fraud in a similar auto brokering scheme in New York, but Gallant wasn't sentenced for it until he helped the FBI make a racketeering case against 2 members of the Russian Mafia. After testifying against them, he was sentenced to 3 years of supervised release. And it was under this supervised release period that he started this new straw borrower slash Ponzi scheme slash all-around fraud guy act. When he realized that the feds were on his tail during his supervised release, he fled. But Gallant couldn't remain on the lam, as the long arm of the law eventually caught up with him. His trial was conducted, and the court sentenced him to 126 months in jail. Number 1. Punishing sinners? Zane Kaiser blackmailed thousands of, let's call them, adult film purveyors worldwide out of about £4 million. At the time Zane got sentenced, he was the most prolific cyber criminal to be sentenced in the United Kingdom. According to the court, Zane's crimes were so extensive that the criminal justice system had simply never seen anything like it. Zane was just recently sentenced, but he was arrested for his crimes about 5 years ago. However, due to the complexity of the investigation and mental health concerns, his trial has been delayed. So how did Zane manage to scam all these investors to these sites? Let's just say he had some help. Zane first started in cybercrime journey by making money off ransomware attacks, viruses that freeze up the victim's computer until a ransom was paid. After a while, Zane became bold. He contacted the Russian controller of an extremely potent cyber attack tool with the promise that he would split his profits with them if his planned mass blackmail operation was successful. To further cement his operation, he also forged connections with Chinese and American cybercriminals who could help him move the cash without it leading back to him. Once he was done with those preparations, the operation itself began. Zane bought advertising space on sites and put malicious links on the ads. The links were set up so that people who clicked on them would immediately download some malware named Angler. If the victim's laptop didn't have great antivirus systems in place, Angler would deliver a virus to the computer that would seize the entire system. Once control was established, the malware would display a notice that told the victim that the FBI had seized the computer. The message said that the seizure was in light of the user's crimes watching these videos. In the same message, the user would be informed that if they didn't pay around a £100 fine, they would be charged to court and could be imprisoned for up to 3 years. This was usually enough motivation for most users to pay the purported fee. The companies that Zane purchased these ads from were wholly unaware of his nefarious actions. The scam was extremely successful and Zane made a lot of money. Law enforcement officials still aren't sure of just how Zane made, but managed a rough estimate of at least $4 billion. And what did Zane spend the money on? Well, he called himself the King, if that's any indication. He spent the bulk of his cash on high-end hotels, women, gambling, drugs, and a £5,000 Rolex watch. Most of his victims simply paid the ransom. Rather than going to the police, getting malware from an adult site isn't something most people want to admit. But how was Zane finally caught if the victims never went to the police? The simple truth is that Zane had too strong of a hand. After he'd been at his business for a while, one of the advertising companies he bought ad space off discovered that he was a cyber criminal. When the company confronted him, Zane antagonized them by threatening to harm the company's employees. Not to be intimidated, one of the ad companies reported to the police, in a rare case where the ad company was actually the hero. And that was when Zane's goose was cooked. The NCA got on his trail and worked with partners in the US, Canada, Europe, and the Crown Prosecution Service to track him down and arrest him. He was hit with 11 charges, including blackmail, fraud, computer offenses, and possessing criminal property. At first, Zane pled not guilty, but he eventually switched his plea and was sentenced to 6 years in jail. He was also ordered to pay back around £270,000 in restitution. Certain businessmen aren't strangers to luxury. In a world where international relations are set to the background of expensive dinners, lavish vacations, and the most exclusive wines, it doesn't come as a surprise someone might have used it as an opportunity to scam people out of money. And that's exactly what Fat Leonard did, and to none other than the US Navy. With bribes that included exclusive gifts like Cuban cigars, $30,000 hotel bills, and fancy cognac, Leonard was able to secure port contracts with the Navy, turning himself into the go-to man when it came to port activities in Southeast Asia. Fat Leonard would overbill his services to the Navy with the consent of some of the institution's top officials, thus making a ton of money to use as bribes again. Infamously known as Fat Leonard, Leonard Francis was raised in Penang, Malaysia, where he lived a very financially comfortable life since childhood. Although he was part of a wealthy family, the drama inside his house was far from nurturing. His mom, aware of his father's constant infidelities, turned him into her personal informant to prevent his father from bringing other women home. She also abandoned him and took his siblings with her. Francis's family had inherited his grandfather's maritime logistics firm, which he founded in 1946, and had successful business in some of the busiest ports in Southeast Asia. Notoriously obese from a young age, Francis faced legal troubles as a young adult. At 21, he was arrested after Malaysian police found a series of guns in his property, a terrible infraction in the country. Added to this, he was the owner of an infamous bar where sketchy individuals were the usual patrons. Although he was able to escape the first sentence, he would have had to go to prison and receive a whipping. His charges were later appealed by the court, and he was sentenced to 18 months in jail. He took this as a push forward and decided to fully immerse himself in his family's maritime logistics firm. He didn't know much about it, but made sure to hire a string of retired Navy officers and former officials from the navies of Malaysia and the Philippines to teach him about the trade. He then ventured outside Malaysia and opened his headquarters in Singapore. At this time, his company was serving ports all over Asia. He was able to secure contracts with the U.S. Navy and also internationally with navies from Mexico, Netherlands, and India. At one point, his company had more than 50 vessels and introduced a special protection service which trained military men from Nepal to ward off pirates from their client ships. Over the years, Francis was able to create a lucrative and direct connection with the U.S. Navy. At one point, he was the main supplier of fuel and other goods for their vessels. He used his expertise and access to goods to get a lot of Navy informants so he could steer business his way for around 25 years. By pitching their services for a notoriously low fee, Glenn Defense made sure they were an attractive bet for the Navy. Using its internal contacts, the company would then start billing them with new invoices for fake services and thus increasing the amount of money the Navy had to pay, the essence of its overcharging scheme. Many rivals, including DEA Global, a South Korean company, had complained about the low bids. In their case, Glenn Defense had pitched their services for almost a third of the price DEA was going for, a clear indicator of something weird happening. But this wouldn't stop Francis from continuing his streak of flirts with the Navy. On one occasion, his company became the prime donor of the Navy League of the United States, a nonprofit related to the institution. At one of their events, Glenn Defense donated 2 matching Rolex watches worth $30,000. Francis lived up to his reputation as a rich man. Whenever his cars would be seen in the streets in Singapore, people would look closely. He was also known for going extra on his holiday decorations for his 70,000 square foot home. It was reported that he once spent $75,000 on the creation of a Christmas light showcase at his home that drew the attention of hundreds. Francis went all out when receiving naval officers. He would personally greet them as the ship arrived at the pier and made sure the arrangements for the shopping trips, concerts, and events were all taken care of, even going as far as arranging a limo and a personal driver. Banquets, parties, and everything else was part of the roster. The officers would enjoy meals ranging from expensive Kobe beef to Cuban cigars and whiskey. Francis would also call in his elite team of Thai pole dancers for adult entertainment. The officers would thank him extensively through personalized Bravo Zulus, notes using the Navy slang for well done. In them, they would explain how his hospitality was something they'd remember for a long time. Francis felt proud whenever he received a note like this. He would display the notes in the company's brochures as a way of getting further endorsements. Francis's tactics were based around overbilling the Navy for his services with the consent of the higher-ranking officers whom he had seduced with expensive goods and trips. But this didn't come without its fair share of lower-ranking officials who would question the bills. David Shaws, a junior officer in charge of accounts, was once faced with a bill for 100,000 gallons of fuel that were allegedly pumped into one of their vessels. This was an impossible amount since the vessel only required 12,000. When he personally called Francis to question him about it, Francis got mad and insulted him. His supervisors at the Navy told him to leave it. Parties were his go-to tactic to convince officers to give him money. This one time during Christmas, Francis threw a lavish celebration at a 5-star hotel that included Dom Perignon, lobster, and an array of expensive meals. As per tradition, he also included some lady escorts dressed as Santa's little helpers, some of of whom went to a private after-party with a few senior officers. The next day, Francis sent them a bill for $600,000, stating it was for a sewage service. After some hesitation, the officer in charge agreed to pay for it as a retribution for the party. To get his hands on internal information from the Navy, Francis bribed some people working directly inside the institution. For example, he contacted Sharon Cower, a Navy officer from Singapore, who admitted to receiving $100,000 in cash and luxury vacations in Dubai in exchange for internal contract information. Francis also reached out to Paul Simpkins, a Navy contract supervisor, who helped him rig Navy contracts in the Philippines and Thailand for an initial $50,000 that turned into $450,000 after Simpkins asked for more. Over time, Francis slowly penetrated the higher ranks of the Navy to the point where commanding officials would be asking for plane tickets, prostitutes, and other offerings on a daily basis. It was his people skills that made him so successful and on demand. Francis's approach wasn't only financial. He used devious techniques to befriend the officers and know exactly what their weak points were. He employed his charm to approach the men, get to know them, and then give them what they needed based on their personalities. Travel tickets, prostitutes, or money. Sometimes all of them. It was a sure way to secure information on his competitors. Sometimes Francis would use simple tech gadgets like cell phones or video game consoles as bribes for the officers. Such was the case as Dan Laug, who provided Glenn Defense with insider information about its competitors for around 3 years. Francis and his team handed him a new phone, tablet computer, and hotel reservations all over Asia until eventually they ended up giving him a $1,000 a month allowance. When investigators began to take notice of Fat Leonard's strategy, he didn't budge. Francis devised another way to keep track of what was happening. He used his known tactics to turn NCIS agent John Beliveau into his personal informant. Beliveau, who would supply him with material investigators had on the company by going into the NCIS database. In exchange, as usual, Francis sent him prostitutes and cash. Even with an investigation underway, Glenn Defense was still able to score 3 more contracts with the Navy for up to $200 million. The agreements meant that they were able to serve ports all over Asia, Australia, and the larger Pacific area. The Navy went as far as making him a semi-permanent feature at its events. He was invited to change of command ceremonies in San Diego and Hawaii. As this was going on, the Navy started taking measures to catch Francis. They decided to drop fake reports that indicated Glenn Defense's case was closed and no further investigation was needed. After learning this, Francis traveled to San Diego for a ceremony and another business proposal meeting with the Navy. Once he finished his presentation, he went back to his hotel where he was arrested. John Beliveau had a similar fate. He was arrested in Washington on the same day and pleaded guilty. Finally faced in court, Francis pleaded guilty to federal charges of bribery, conspiracy to commit bribery, and conspiracy to defraud. Fat Leonard confessed to having overcharged the Navy for the services provided in several ports all over Asia and paid off officials with lavish gifts like expensive alcohol, hotel accommodations, and even handmade ship models. He went on to supply information about some of the officials that worked for him as moles by handing him inside data from the Navy as well as his competitors. Francis faced up to 25 years in prison and was ordered to pay up to $35 million as restitution for the money he illegally took from the Navy. And while he confessed and took accountability, according to the court, he still named 7 different Navy officials who were part of his scam as a way to seem more cooperative. Just a mere 3 weeks before he was to be sentenced, Francis was nowhere to be found. According to the media, he took off his ankle bracelet and escaped. Many neighbors of the rental house he was staying said they saw many cars with out-of-state plates and even a U-Haul van outside his home. Fat Leonard had been granted a special medical furlough because of his health, with which he was able to live in a rental home in California during the time of the trial with his 3 children and mother. The court had ordered Francis to be watched 24/7. On many occasions, the judge stated their worries about the possibility of Francis playing a trick like this. He had multiple requests denied, including one where he wanted to walk his kids to school. One time it was reported his home went without surveillance for 3 whole hours. Francis went to court to apologize, stating the security guard in charge had taken a long lunch break. San Diego police received an anonymous call around 2 p.m. that requested a check on Francis's location. Police stormed the property only to find it empty. No security guards were found, and his bracelet was cut off and found inside a cooler. Since Francis was located a 40-minute drive from Tijuana, it was highly possible he had fled the country. U.S. Marshals put out a red notice requesting law agencies around the world for help in locating and arresting him. Interpol finally caught him at a Caracas airport in Venezuela. Francis had flown to Venezuela from Mexico, first making a stop in Cuba. It was reported he was about to board a flight to Russia. Back in 2018, Kelly Christina said Brad Pitt reached out to her regarding a charity benefit to help victims of Hurricane Katrina through his foundation called Make It Right. Kelly and Pitt struck up a business deal on their own. This deal included Kelly making arrangements for 5 events and speaking with the public about raising funds for the foundation. In return, Pitt promised to make an appearance as long as he was paid $40,000. For Kelly, Brad's appearance meant everything. People would literally throw money at the organization if Brad Pitt so much as breathed in the room. However, days before the event, and after the $40,000 went through, something would come up and Pitt would have to cancel. However, it was never about the money. You see, in Christina's eyes, she and Brad formed a much deeper connection, one that went far beyond raising money for Katrina victims. They were in love. Kelly is quite an accomplished woman by several metrics. She ranges from an astute public speaker to a best-selling author. In addition, she runs a medical company called KD Staffing. She's a highly sought-after professional who plans to expand her business even further. All she wants is to make a difference in society. Christina's humble life began in the restaurant industry. She liked the business and decided to pursue her studies in hotel and restaurant management at the University of North Texas. She launched a medical firm in 2007 at just 30 years old. We're not sure how she went from restaurant worker to hotel management to medical staffing. Still, Christina was making a killing. Her business opened up just before the 2008 recession, and through all the highs and lows, Christina still came out on top. She even found time to write a book. Kelly was inspired to write her own novel titled Riding the Executive Roller Coaster: Medical Staffing Cases. The book follows fictional characters who experience real-life events, some of which she experienced herself. A character in Kelly's novel named Catherine Lane is loosely based on herself. The story follows Catherine's life for nearly 8 years, though there's some confusion about whether her book is a memoir, novel, or soap opera. Christina still experienced a few rough patches in her life for all her success, including homelessness. However, those patches are what ultimately inspired her to write the book. The roughest patch came when she was about to marry a world-famous Oscar-winning actor named Brad Pitt, or so she thought. But it was all smoke and mirrors. Christina was never actually talking to Brad Pitt. Instead, she was talking to, and sending money to, a con artist somewhere in the world. This mysterious scammer made off with the $40,000 and Christina's bleeding heart after bailing on all 5 appearances. That was the last straw, and Christina never sent another penny. Instead, she sent the real Brad Pitt a $100,000 lawsuit. Brad and his ex-wife Angelina had briefly lived in the French Quarters when Make It Right was founded back in 2007. They had aimed to create sustainable housing for those who lost their homes during Hurricane Katrina. The goal was to build green homes with environmentally friendly materials, but those very same materials are what would eventually come back and haunt them. In 2009, news outlets called the project Brad's gift to the citizens of New Orleans, but shortly after, most of the houses were cited for building code violations. Make It Right stopped paying the landscapers to take care of the properties, and Mother Nature had its way. In 2018, New Orleans residents filed several lawsuits against the Make It Right Foundation. Those residents claimed that the foundation had used questionable materials, leading to plumbing, electrical, and structural issues. Basically, the houses were one giant big problem. As of 2022, only 6 out of the 109 homes were determined to still be in reasonably good shape. The remaining homes were abandoned after mold and other issues proved to be too much for the residents. Make It Right officially came under fire in 2014 once 24 of the green homes had begun rotting away. The foundation quickly went on the offensive, saying they used a special kind of wood called timbersill, which was supposed to be toxic-free. So what is this timbersill, and what was so magical about it that Brad Pitt just had to use it on all these homes? Timbersill is a glass-infused wood product that's supposed to last for 40 years. They advertise the material as an effective barrier to lumber rot and decay without using toxic ingredients. A spokesperson for the foundation said they didn't want to use deck lumber with harmful chemicals. It didn't take long for the wood to start rotting and changing color. What was found to be a problem in 2010 didn't make headlines until 2013. However, Timbersill claimed that they weren't at fault. They pointed out that their product just wasn't meant for the moist New Orleans climates. They placed the blame on the builders, as they should have known that before they built 109 new green homes. Within 3 years, rot affected 30 different houses, and Make It Right looked like they had made it wrong. But as early as 2010, the builders noticed mold forming in the timber sill. It cost over $12,000 per home to remove the faulty wood and replace it. The Make It Right Foundation was ready to take legal action and sue the timber sill manufacturer for $500,000. Brad Pitt put out a statement saying the foundation was prepared to rebuild the homes ASAP. Joel Embry, the vice president for Timbersill, expressed his sincerest apologies for the problems the foundation had with their product. Make It Right spent nearly $360,000 on materials and wanted $500,000 for damages and repairs they'd have to complete. They eventually settled the lawsuit 2 years later, but the exact dollar amount remains unknown. As lawsuits mounted, Make It Right abandoned the entire project. They stopped paying for landscaping and they eventually stopped paying property taxes. As of 2022, one Make It Right subsidiary owes the city of New Orleans $15,000 in delinquent taxes. David DeJay is an architect of Ghanaian and British descent. He's widely known for designing structures worldwide, the most popular being the Museum of African American History located in Washington, D.C. There was a small building designed by DeJay in the ward where the other New Orleans homes were being rebuilt. The foundation had deemed the house unstable and it was soon knocked down. The city posted a warning sign on the house that said it was in danger of collapsing. Before it was a structural mess, the Ajayi house sold for $130,000 to Kamaria Allen in 2011. However, 2 years later, it was a vacant building on the verge of collapse. In a 2018 interview, she talked about how she discovered fungus growing in her bedroom and kitchen. She found all of this within her first year living there. It wasn't until 2012 when she was finally able to sell the home back to Make It Right, and her old house has remained abandoned ever since. In 2020, it finally came down. Pictures of the home resurfaced showing broken beams along with missing panels. With each home costing $150,000 to build, the entire project cost $26.8 million. In Kelly's efforts to make it right, she filed a lawsuit against Pitt for $100,000, stating he was romantic with her and was able to get her to pay $40,000 to appear at charity events. Pitt's lawyer actually came to her defense, saying she was the victim of a scammer, something that she clearly couldn't see was happening. Still, Pitt's legal team made sure the court knew Brad had nothing to do with Christina. They'd never met, they'd never spoken, they'd never so much as sent an Instagram message. While they felt bad that Christina fell victim to a scammer, they weren't about to let her take Pitt down with her. Christina, at first, was incredulous that it wasn't the real Brad Pitt who would have taken money from her for appearance and not have shown up, and also pretended to want to date her. But she eventually, somehow, realized that the real Brad Pitt had no real incentive to try and scam $40,000 out of her when he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She admitted to being scammed by a fake Brad Pitt. But here's the twist. She decided to continue with her case anyways because she felt that he still should have some blame. According to her, the tens of thousands she paid for Pitt's non-appearances were still deposited into different bank accounts of various staff members of Make It Right. Of course, anyone with half a brain can see that money went to the scammer, because why would the fake Brad Pitt continue to scam if she kept sending money to the wrong bank account? Christina also wanted to bring to light, in her words, quote, fan collections and donation relationships with Hollywood stars. She thinks that the shady activity between fans and Hollywood stars has been going on, quote, under the radar, and it needs to be brought to the light. In her mind, Brad Pitt and Hollywood stars like Pitt should make an effort to protect their fans from online scams. Brad Pitt ultimately emerged victorious in his efforts to get the $100,000 lawsuit dismissed. Unfortunately for Christina, she's still out the $40,000 she paid to meet Brad Pitt. That scammer to this day is still unidentified. Bill Foucher was sitting in the parlor of his off-track betting company when Marty Terrell walked up to him with an irresistible deal. Terrell had come to bet on his own horse, and he was confident it would win. He convinced Foucher to stake his money on the horse. True to his word, Terrell's horse won, and Foucher packed his tidy winnings home. Just like that, both men developed trust in each other. But there was one big problem. Marty Terrell never owned the horse he claimed to own. Their relationship would take a drastic turn as they both realized the other person's true intentions. Terrell grew up in Massachusetts with his mother and sister, Marcia Hawkins. He started gambling at a young age. One time, his mother's phone bill ran up to $1,000. She, a single mother working multiple jobs to feed her children, didn't even earn that much in a month. She called the phone company to plead with them regarding the bills, and it turned out that Terrell had run up the bill with toll calls to a New York betting line. Terrell got his first sports talk show when he was a teenager. It was a 2-hour program called the Sunday Sports Page on WPOE. He showed incredible potential even at that time, but he struggled to get the audience to call into his show. He gave his sidekick, Doug Stotz, a dime and asked him to call the show from a payphone and disguise his voice. He felt this would encourage other people to call, and it did. But he was fired 3 weeks later for criticizing the magazine Greenfield Recorder, calling it the Greenfield Distorter. Still, Terrell had undeniable talent. He was edgy and boisterous and knew how to reel in the audience. Bob Diamond, staff at the station WHAI at the time, recognized Terrell's unlimited talent and tremendous vision and convinced the station's co-owner Ann Banish to make Terrell the sports director. As sports director, Terrell did high school play-by-play of high school football and basketball. The show was successful. It made a lot of money for the station and created more marketing opportunities. But his energy towards sportscasting was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, he was pumping the ratings, but on the other hand, he was stirring up trouble for the station. Once, while covering a match at the Springfield Civic Center, Terrell abruptly cut his set because he saw something that looked wrong and chased the game's officials into the locker room. Another time, he sold cars and promised buyers free snow tires, but closed the shop before buyers could receive the tires. Terrell was a smooth talker who didn't see the need to back his talk with action. He quickly earned a reputation for over-promising and under-delivering. When he left WHAI for another station, he had become, according to Banish, a station manager's worst nightmare. In 1996, he became the station manager at 1490 AM The Jock. Like his previous stints, The Jock was a huge success. He named himself the Mouth of the Midwest and collaborated with Prairie Meadows track announcer Ken Miller to broadcast Iowa's first ever 2-hour sports talk show. At its peak, the station had advertisers paying a record-breaking $150 for 30-second spots. The station went well until 2009 when he went off on his KXNO show, blustering and spewing profanities that got him and Larry Cutler, the host of another show, fired. Jeff Kahn, the producer who failed to mute a microphone between shows, was also fired. For all his woes, many people believe Terrell had a brilliant career as a radio host. Political pundit and former Terrell protege Steve Deese still thinks Terrell is one of the best things to happen to radio in Iowa. According to him, Terrell changed radio in Iowa and brought real, edgy, local talk radio to Des Moines. And to Deese, there was no doubt Terrell's left an indelible impression on the media in their community. Between 2016 and 2017, Terrell swindled at least 8 people for $1.5 million. He would contact potential investors, telling them that they could invest in sports tickets, which he would buy and resell at a profit, and they would all share the profit. When he first started this scheme, things weren't looking too bad. He paid his investors back and even gave them VIP access to events. Then he told one lie, then another, and he kept telling lies until he had dug such a deep pit of lies for himself that he couldn't find an easy way out. Not only was he lying and defaulting on payments, but he was also using their money for personal purchases and paying other investors. When they asked about their money, he would give them checks he knew would bounce, then provide them with false wire transfer information. He also engaged in check kiting between September 2016 and December 2017. He submitted several false debit card fraud claims to get cash. In November 2016, Terrell sent out 4 faulty checks totaling $355,522 to Burlington. He also collected $15,000 from one man on one occasion and $77,836.34 from the same man on another occasion. In the fall of 2016, he used one of his investors' American Express credit cards to get over $1,000. He then deposited a check for over $13,800 into his 62 and even limited bank account after he had already deposited the check elsewhere. Terrell was so notorious that we may never really know the true extent of his scams. So many of his victims refused to be part of the investigation and trial, perhaps for fear of being identified as someone gullible enough to fall for Terrell's scheme, or because they knew there was no way he would be able to pay his debts. One of his victims was Jason Whitinger, whom Terrell scammed for over $1 million. Whitinger was under the impression that he was buying a radio station in Spencer, Iowa, but Terrell had no intention of delivering a radio station. Whitinger later called him a scumbag, the lowest form of a human being. Before the FBI started investigating him, about 24 people had sued him for various small claims. Ticket brokers in New York and Chicago claimed he had refused to pay for blocks of sports tickets he bought. Some people claimed he refused to pay his debts, and a broadcaster in Texas claimed he refused to pay for airtime he purchased. His ex-wife in Massachusetts claimed he failed to make alimony payments. The judgments against him in these other claims amount to over $4 million in restitution. In 2017, Terrell bought flight tickets for himself and 8 friends to see a World Series game between between the Chicago Cubs and the Cleveland Indians and failed to pay for it. He owed so many local businesses and his friends' businesses. He even owed his lawyer payment for legal services. To escape the pit he had dug for himself, Terrell filed for bankruptcy. The petition was so ridiculous that it was thrown out of the court window. He owed the government taxes, lied about his earnings, and everything else. He often refused to reply or show up in court when sued. One example of him refusing to respond to a lawsuit against him is when Joseph Farron and Justin Lausch from Des Moines sued him over scamming them off $11,238 for advertising that never aired. After Terrell and Foucher's first encounter, Terrell came back with an even sweeter deal. Foucher's OTB business had been struggling at the time. Terrell promised that he could make a profit if he could invest $3,200 in Donegal Racing, where he was part owner and had a 3% interest in Paddy O'Prado. Foucher paid, but Terrell never delivered on his promise. As Foucher recalled later, Terrell was only out to grab me for all that I would give him. Terrell didn't own any horse, and he didn't have shares in any company. Foucher died in 2018 and never recovered his money from Terrell. Terrell enjoyed spending money on luxury items. He believed himself to be in the class of the wealthy and prosperous. Everything he did was in excess. He'd look in his car and there'd be 4 shirts from Von Mauer with the price tag still on, 2 pairs of shoes. He'd have $4,000 worth of stuff in his car he'd never worn yet, said John McDermott, Terrell's radio partner while he worked at Jerry Crawford's Toyota showroom during play-by-play of the Des Moines minor league basketball team which Crawford owned. Terrell didn't spend his money taking care of his family or home. In May 2014, his house faced foreclosure, but he didn't attempt to leave, saying, "There was a second mortgage on the house. I'm paying them and it's over with." His first wife, Margaret Daniello, said he took out the mortgages for the house in her name and didn't make the payments. The house, worth about $200,000, was sold to someone else through a sheriff's sale. When he married his second wife, Stephanie Gifford, he took her on trips to sporting events and they stayed at luxury hotels. She believed he was a millionaire investor and knew nothing about his lies and deceptions. They later got divorced in 2014, and she later said about him, "Marty had too many lies and secrets upon secrets. He stole her money, ran up credit cards in her name without her knowledge, and bankrupted her. He's a bully, he's a fraud, he's a liar," she wrote in a Facebook post in 2017. As for his personality, Terrell isn't anyone's favorite person. Even Terrell knows he takes it too far. He says, "I've thought about this, and I've had time to make some changes about overpromising and underdelivering." But did he? He's a larger-than-life character who had spent the larger part of 2 decades hopping from radio to radio, gambling away his stolen funds, battling alcoholism, surviving feuds with his contemporaries, and coming back with more lies every time he survived a legal battle. Terrell formed many relationships during his career, and one of them was with Boston Globe columnist Bob Ryan. The relationship was quite surprising. Ryan is an admired author, and it baffled everyone that he could associate himself with a guy like Terrell. Even more shocking is that Terrell dealt with Ryan in the same dishonest manner he dealt with everyone else. Des Moines CPA Becky Kyle prepared a transaction list for Terrell in 2011 that showed 6 checks payable to Ryan, each for $3,000 from April to December. The checks were payment for Ryan calling into a show and making an occasional in-person appearance. Terrell's ex-wife Stephanie Gifford thinks he was clueless about Terrell's shady dealings, but he admitted in an email to Greenfield Recorder that he had received his share of bounced checks from Terrell over the years. Terrell owed him about $30,000 for shows. He was charmingly slippery, Ryan said, but who could have imagined the scope of his machinations? No, I had no idea. In 2019, an Iowa grand jury handed Terrell a 10-count indictment. His offenses included unpaid airtime he bought, 2 divorces and unpaid alimonies, his home foreclosure, outstanding child support, an order of protection against him for alleged physical abuse, and several civil suits. On March 13, 2020, Terrell appeared before Judge William Mazanek III. He pleaded guilty to defrauding a Red Sox fan out of $4,750 worth of tickets. Someone, an acquaintance with a score to settle, informed the police that he was staying at his sister's house in Deerfield. The police picked him up on an outstanding warrant by Deerfield Detective Sergeant Adam Sokolowski. Bail was initially set at $5,000, but was later reduced to $2,500. The 10-count charges carries a sentence of up to 20 years, but he only got 41 months for pleading guilty to mail fraud in a deal he cut with the police. He also has to pay a fine of $250,000. The hearing was very emotional, with Terrell tearfully apologizing to his victims and tendering a special apology to one of them, identified only as JW in court. That apology didn't mean anything to JW. Terrell admitted his faults and realized that only he himself was making his life a, quote, unending nightmare, and that he knew it would eventually come to this. The court gave him the right to turn himself in after the sentencing. Robert Freegard already had a long history of spreading lies before working as a bartender at a British pub in the early 1990s. There, he crossed paths with a trio of students from nearby Harper Adams Agricultural College. Going by the name Rob, he sparked a friendship with Maria, Sarah, and John, who were from privileged backgrounds and looking for a bit of adventure in their lives. They seemed to find what they were looking for as they learned more about the friendly and mysterious bartender. Rob started dating Maria, and he soon became friendly with John. After building their trust for some time, he shared a big secret, and they promised not to tell anyone about it. He said he wasn't a bartender at all, but was working undercover as an MI5 agent. For those unfamiliar with the secretive United Kingdom agency, it serves roughly the same function as the FBI in America. According to Rob, he was sent to the area to investigate terrorist plots by Irish Republican Army. Members of the notorious militia, he said, were behind multiple deaths, including the death of John's college buddy, which had been staged to look like an accident. In retrospect, it's easy to lay out the intricately woven lies and misrepresentations that Rob made about himself. As for his actual identity, however, it's not always so easy to suss out the truth. He was born in 1971 and hailed from Derbyshire, where his single mother raised him and his sister. They moved around a lot during his formative years, and those who knew him as a student described him as mostly quiet, introverted kid. Of course, he always seemed to find some joy in pulling pranks on his classmates, which paved the way for the scams and schemes he hatched later on in life. By the time he was 14, Rob had dropped out of school and spent the next few years forming the basis for a life built on lies and deception. When his teenage years ended, he was already leaving victims in his wake. He struck up a relationship with a teacher several years older than him. He began scamming her out of her money after convincing her that he was independently wealthy as a young man. The teacher, Allison Hopkins, tried to break things off when she found out that he had fraudulently used her credit card and accessed her bank account to pad his own pockets. This was all after Allison agreed to extend a personal loan for £1,500 that he had no intention of ever repaying. When Allison told Rob she wanted to end their relationship, he became outraged, and she feared for her own safety. Things got so bad that she relocated to a town more than 200 miles away. Even that wasn't enough to stop him, though. He soon tracked her down and broke into her home to kidnap her. Fortunately for Allison, he failed. Rob's ex shared the frightening story with her friends, who then told the local police. As Rob faced criminal charges in early 1993, he found an opportunity to leave the area and set off on a life on the run from the law. His lies varied from victim to victim, but one type of scam seemed to be a recurring theme throughout this period of his life. Rob focused on finding women who would fall for his charm long enough for him to cheat them out of their cash. Not all of Rob's victims were vulnerable women, however. In one case, he befriended a jeweler in Sheffield and convinced the man that he was being recruited for a secret mission. However, this case was a bit different than most of Rob's other crimes, since he didn't seem to steal or defraud any money from Simon Young. Instead, he developed a series of increasingly bizarre tests for Simon to complete in the area. For starters, he specified where his victims should travel, including the bus routes, staircases, and even doors he should use during his daily activities. A few of the humiliating missions Rob convinced Simon to complete involved reading a sexually explicit publication while riding on the train and delivering a can opener to a bartender at a local bar. Although these and other related tests had no real purpose and were apparently just an effort to embarrass his supposed friend, Rob told Simon that it was all part of a much larger plan still in progress. After cutting ties with Simon, Rob moved on to another victim. He hired Elizabeth Bartholomew to provide childcare in 1996, and they were soon involved in a romantic relationship. That relationship devolved into degrading and abusive acts after Rob convinced Elizabeth that she had been placed on an IRA hit list. To test her loyalty and guarantee her safety, Rob instructed Elizabeth to perform acts that he said had been dictated explicitly by his bosses in the secret agency. He coerced her into a series of public stunts, including dressing up in ornate traditional Indian garments or pretending to be a Jehovah's Witness. He also instructed her to fundamentally change how she looked and presented herself to others. Finally, Rob exerted his influence over Elizabeth to the point that she agreed to change her name. Although he never admitted what he got out of pulling his victims' strings to the point that they agreed to degrade and embarrass themselves in public, it seems as if he was acting on a deep-seated desire from his youth. While frequently moving around as a child, it was almost impossible for Rob to form long-lasting relationships with schoolmates. To create any lasting impressions on those around him, he felt as if he had to plan and execute increasingly alarming stunts and pranks that would get a rise out of his chums while embarrassing his victims. As he grew older, his desire to be noticed never fully subsided. In fact, it grew even more pronounced, as did his ability to develop bizarre and humiliating hoaxes to watch those around him jump through hoops. Along the way, he built up a convincing persona that helped him bridge the gap between a relatively harmless prankster and a cruel con man. Not satisfied with merely embarrassing his victims, Rob became increasingly motivated by a desire to get rich through his elaborate schemes. Years after he met John and Sarah at the British pub and convinced them that he was a member of MI5, his bigger plan fell into place. Throughout the late 1990s, he acted on a scheme to extort his victims out of hundreds of thousands of pounds. Specifically, he convinced John to embark on a top-secret mission and successfully extorted more than 300,000 pounds from his family. Similarly, he hatched a scheme that allowed him to scam Sarah and her family out of another 200,000 pounds. During this period, he also convinced Maria to marry him, adding her surname Hendy to his name, officially becoming Robert Hendy Freegard. He used coercion and threats to keep the force intact, but he continued to look for other victims throughout the same period. One notable example was Leslie Gardner. He met the woman at a nightclub and told her he worked for a nuclear fuel company. Using this lie as the basis for his long con, he stole another 16,000 pounds from her. A con man tactic he used to defraud his victims involved forcing them to get odd jobs and hand over their earnings to him. He convinced them that he needed money to continue offering secretive protection against the evildoers intent on causing them harm. Even as his wife and 2 children faced eviction and abject poverty, Rob continued living the high life. He initiated relationships with several other women and used variations of his familiar scheme to extort a massive amount of money from multiple new victims. Rob seemed to be pursuing a fantasy life akin to a James Bond thriller, but he clearly lacked all the positive traits that 007 brought to the table. Instead, he focused solely on the character's negative characteristics, lies, and womanizing to carry out his criminally abusive plans. Authorities launched a wide-ranging investigation that spanned more than a year and a half and cost roughly £2.5 million. In the end, various agencies pieced together an intricate tale that Rob used to con different individuals out of their money. It took a while for investigators to determine the extent of a decade-long scheme, but it all seemed worth it when prosecutors developed a case against him with a host of criminal charges, including 2 counts of kidnapping, 8 counts of criminal deception, and 10 counts of theft. In total, law enforcement officers found that he directly extorted money from at least 8 victims, 7 women and 1 man. The counts against him were enough to land him behind bars for the rest of his life upon conviction. One of those victims was Kim Adams, who became his fiancée in 2002 and lost roughly 22,000 pounds. After realizing her mistake a bit too late, she refused to remain a helpless victim and staged a scheme of her own that helped bring Rob to justice. Thanks largely to Kim's testimony during the trial, a court found Rob guilty in 2005 and sentenced him to life in prison. Kim helped authorities track down a laundry list of incriminating evidence, including a stockpile of passports belonging to women who were previously reported missing. The investigation was enough to convince prosecutors that the case should go to trial, and even most of his lawyers seemed uninterested in trying to defend his actions. 3 of 4 defense attorneys who initially accepted a job working on the case reconsidered. They resigned due to what they described as a professional embarrassment. The evidence presented in court was enough to score a conviction, but any victory for his victims would be short-lived. A few years later, he appealed his kidnapping charges by arguing that his victims were never physically prevented from leaving him. Although he was obviously using threats and fear tactics to keep them captive, a judge ruled in his favor and granted his appeal, meaning he was released from prison in 2009. As expected, Rob returned to his familiar ways after regaining his freedom. He soon met Sandra Clifton and embarked on a whirlwind romance with the single mother. After moving in with Sandra and her 2 children in 2012, Rob began exerting his influence over the household, and the kids suspected that he was bad news. Less than 2 years later, he convinced Sandra to leave her family to live a secretive life with him. Her ex-husband and the father of her children investigated the situation and discovered that Rob, who was now introducing himself as David, had driven Sandra into financial ruin. Before long, the family learned about Rob's criminal past. Sandra's son, now in his mid-20s, hasn't seen his mother since he was a teen. He's gone public with his effort to convince Sandra to leave the man who destroyed their family. He's gone on multiple television programs to plead his case and assert that Rob is using his power of persuasion to brainwash his mother. It's unclear what lies he's using to keep his latest victim captive, but there's no doubt that his web continues to leave broken relationships and shattered dreams wherever he goes. He scammed over $24 million with a cow scam? And she was forced into scamming her followers on Instagram. Let's get right into some of the weirdest scams. Number 5. Cow scam. Around $24 million was the amount that Robert Blom from South Dakota stole from clients and investors in a cattle business that went sour when he was busted. Blom pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering by scamming investors and making them believe his business was more successful than it really was. The man, who grew up in Holland, South Dakota, and had dedicated 15 years to his animal feeding business, would lure local farmers he already knew into buying cattle from him with the promise that he would feed them and sell them for profit. Blom altered financial documents and sold the same group of cattle to various buyers. Court documents state that over 50 individuals, including businesses, were scammed and millions of dollars were taken from them. One of them, the First Dakota National Bank, said Blom overdrew his account over $1 million and owed them more than $6 million in total, for which he was making an interest rate of $1,000 per day. Blom's victims included close friends like Jeff Hampton and co-workers like Robert Meyer, who spent 14 years doing business with Blom. Both of them talked in court and stated their financial losses. One of them asked the judge to impose the heaviest sentence the law required. It has been said by various South Dakota lawyers that this is one of the largest financial scams ever seen in the state. One of his biggest investors, Kurt Plamp, lost about $1 million. He was Blom's brother-in-law for 28 years and trusted his business abilities. Plamp would see small returns on his original $750,000 investment, only about $20,000 to $30,000. It was when Plamp's bank gave him a call that he became suspicious. The operation spanned a period of years from 2014 to 2019. During this time, Blom fraudulently told his investors he would use their money to buy new cattle to feed and sell, promising to pay them back with profits. Instead, he used their money to pay back old investors without actually selling the cattle. Blom purchased various groups of cattle from livestock companies that he later offered to multiple investors, claiming he would take care of both their investment and the cattle to be fed. According to court documents, Blom was aware he didn't have the amount of cattle he was claiming to sell, so he forged invoices to hide the fact he sold the same group of animals to multiple people. After the invoices were sent, Blom received checks from his investors for the requested amounts. Because he sold the same cattle to a lot of people, he wasn't able to pay back all of his investors, since he wasn't making any profit from the actual cattle sale to processing plants. In 2021, Blom pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of money laundering out of the combined 32 charges he faced. He faced up to 40 years in prison. Blom was also presented with a $750,000 restitution fine ordered for the case. Overall, his scheme totaled about $24 million in losses and almost 30,000 animals that went missing. His financial woes date back to 2019 when he was charged for writing a bad check to another cattle buyer. For this, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison and 8 years of probation. Number 4. Fat James Bond. A man from Seaham, England, decided to fully live out his Secret Service spy fantasy by convincing his partner he was indeed a member of Britain's MI5. John Hare, a 53-year-old farmer, had told his girlfriend of 5 years he was working for MI5, and that was the reason he needed to carry a gun with him at all times. According to his partner, he would even carry his .22 with him while dining out. The scam, which lasted around 25 years, made all his closest relatives and partners believe he was actively working for the MI5. He eventually told his lovers he had started as a personal protection agent before he was tapped by the Secret Service. His fake spy lifestyle somehow allowed him to own several properties, including a private bungalow and the house farm he shared with his wife and kids. Turns out, Hare was actually married, and his spy scam seemed to help him get some extra time for female partners. In fact, some of them were so convinced they were still in an official relationship that even when he was caught by the authorities, they thought they were exclusive. His spy facade served as the perfect excuse for him to deceive his multiple lovers. He even went on to give one of them the number of his MI5 unit so she could contact him in case of an emergency. Some of the women actually lived close by to his main house, one of them 10 minutes away and the other 15 minutes in the opposite direction. Hare was so good at convincing these women that he was able to make one of them leave her husband of 46 years. Overall, he was romantically linked to 5 different women. In reality, John Hare was a common farmer who ran a green waste recycling company. When authorities first heard of Hare's case, it was through one of his girlfriends who claimed he had physically assaulted her after an altercation in his house. After further investigation and hearing the women's claims, they started looking for his .22 he supposedly had in his home. Hare had confessed he had the firearm, so police went to his farmhouse to search for it. They were directed to the chicken coop where 30 chickens lived by his wife. At one point, it was his wife who dug up the ground to uncover the hidden gun inside a bread bag. Hare said he had bought it around 2005 to shoot rats. Hare was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. Number 3. Lunch Sisters. 2 women who worked at a Connecticut school cafeteria were busted when it was discovered they were actually stealing money from the cash register at work. The money, which was stolen over the course of 5 years, amounted to almost $500,000. Joanne Pasquarelli and Mary Wilson, sisters, had been working at the New Canaan High School cafeteria for a couple of years before police and the local Board of Education noticed the missing money was a staggering amount. They were both no strangers to drama. During their years of work, they had fostered a reputation as very difficult co-workers. All of this was permitted by their boss, Bruce Gluck, head chef of the high school cafeteria. The New Canaan High School cafeteria was like no other. Farm-to-table products, gluten-free options, and low-calorie foods were all part of the very popular menu Gluck had created. After all, this was a small but very rich Connecticut town that had the budget to do so. While under Gluck's supervision, both sisters were considered Gluck's right hands and ran the high school's kitchen with a very tight grip. On occasions, there were even reports of food thrown and yelling in the workplace. New Canaan High School was taking in a lot of money through their cafeteria, around $2 million a year, with 5% being in cash. And while many schools would outsource the accounting of the service, New Canaan decided to do it themselves. Once Wilson was named into a supervising position, she had access to the many resources the cafeteria had. Wilson took over the duty of personally counting money after every shift, and at the end of the day, she wouldn't let cashiers do it. As the money was coming in every day in cash, both Wilson and Pasquarelli took the larger bills and started taking a couple $100s a day with them. They had no supervision. After a few years, Pasquarelli started working at a different school nearby, and thus their scam grew exponentially. She told one worker that she couldn't register the amount of cash made on the day and forced her to sign a deposit slip lower than the amount of money that went in. And while the school district implemented a new software to count the money and keep a digital registry, Pasquarelli continued to count it herself and sign deposit slips because, according to her, the new system took too long. Their co-workers took notice of these strange proceedings and started going one by one to the police. Both Wilson and Pasquarelli were accused by their co-workers of the shady financial schemes they were running at the 2 different schools. The school district started counting the money that had gone missing. It was discovered that both sisters had stolen from the schools a whopping $478,588. This was only in a period of 5 years because, according to the statute of limitations, they weren't allowed to investigate prior years. It's believed their scam dated back to 15 years. Both sisters went to the police to speak, but there were others to blame. Wilson said she was forced by Gluck to hand him $100 a day. She felt concerned and her job was on the line. Pasquarelli was firm on her belief that no money had gone missing. She said that it was likely that the new food services director had a thing against her, or maybe the kids at school used each other's card pins. Both sisters were charged with larceny in 2018 and pleaded not guilty. They posted bail for $50,000 each before their trials. They were offered settlements. Gluck was also called to court because bank statements showed he had made large deposits of money during the time frame of the crime. Number 2. Cheating husband. As the co-owner of her late husband's trucking company, Frances Hall was accused of altering payroll documents and thus lowering the company's premium insurance payments to the state of Texas. According to officials, the company avoided around $9 million between 2009 and 2016. While these fraudulent schemes aren't uncommon in the business world, what makes this case strange was the situation that took place before her scamming. Hall had been convicted for murdering her husband, Bill Hall Jr., back in 2013. She had discovered him and his mistress driving down the highway in his Range Rover and motorcycle and hit them with their Cadillac Escalade. After this, they got into a chase which ended with her running her car against her husband and his motorcycle. He was rushed to the hospital where he died. Frances was convicted in 2016 and was released in 2018. Hall was charged with aggravated assault and sentenced to 2 years in prison and was given a lower sentence because the judge considered she acted out of sudden passion. Hall believed firmly she didn't purposely go after her husband, but she deeply regretted having chased them down that day. She also stated that the woman his husband had an affair with had sent her multiple texts and videos. Aside from all this, Hall was able to keep her full husband's business, even when her son Justin took her to court to battle the company's control. He was intending to hand control over his father's half of the company to him and his sister Dominique, alleging she shouldn't be able to receive financial report from her crime. Hall's son was trying to take back 50% of the company since his father didn't leave any type of will and everything went directly to his mom. Unfortunately, the judge ruled in favor of Frances and she kept 100% control over the trucking company and other assets. The fraud charges that have been presented against her stem from illegal altering of payroll information that the company provided to Texas Mutual Insurance Company, while also hiding other payroll details that made the company insurance premium payments much lower than they should have legally been. She has been pointed as a direct culprit since the fraud scheme happened when she was co-owner of the company between 2009 and 2016. After an arrest warrant was issued, Hall faced charges for securing execution of a document over $200,000. After turning herself in, she was released on a $20,000 bail. Her lawyers state that Hall denies all allegations and is expected to defend herself in court. Number 1. Reverse influenced. Emma Tomlinson is an aspiring singer from Australia. She says that she had a breakdown when hackers stole her Instagram account. To make matters worse, they demanded her to record videos promoting a Bitcoin scam so they could scam more people. Tomlinson, who had managed to get a few thousand followers on Instagram, had turned to social media as a vehicle to promote her work and create an audience. She became known nationally when she competed in Australia's version of X Factor in 2014 and has been popular for her blend of pop, R&B, and classical crossover. Tomlinson said she received a private message from a friend asking for her account details. Thinking it was a person she trusted, she handed over her email information, the same that links to her Instagram account. A few minutes later, she was locked out of her profile. Somehow, hackers had gotten a hold of a friend's account and posed as her. Added to this, the hackers asked for a $200 payment and requested she had to do a video promoting an illegal cryptocurrency scam. Tomlinson said she felt forced to do it so she could get her account back. She went on to shoot the video, stating the company was trusted and totally legit. After doing the video and paying the $200, the hackers told her that she had to pay an extra $3,000 or they would leak nude pictures of her, which were fake. Tomlinson was desperate, so she paid the amount. In the video, Tomlinson spoke about how she was able to see profits on her cryptocurrency investment only after 3 hours. She went on to say the deal was very real and the company very worthwhile. The video went online later. Tomlinson said she had a breakdown because of the implications of losing the platform she uses to promote her music and how devastating it was to lose control over her public image. Wisconsin dentist Dr. Scott Chermoli built a robust practice in the Jackson area and attracted patients from all walks of life. Some troubling allegations rose to the surface toward the end of his career. According to an insurance executive who testified against the doctor during a trial in March 2022, Chermoli put an outrageous number of crowns into his patients' teeth and had been for several years. Unfortunately for the pawns in his scheme, The dentist's plan went undetected until after he sold his practice. The medical team that took over noticed something peculiar when they reviewed the files Ciarmoli left behind. The industry average in Wisconsin is less than 6 crowns installed for every 100 patients. Ciarmoli's rate was more than 5 times higher. Following an investigation, prosecutors determined that the doctor, who had been practicing dentistry since 1986, was misleading patients into believing their healthy teeth needed a crown. First, Ciarmoli showed his patients x-rays of their teeth and pointed to broken teeth that needed crowns. Of course, these patients didn't know what they were looking at, so they trusted the dentist. Then Ciarmoli went in and intentionally broke their teeth so he could take more x-rays to send to the insurance company. Then the insurance companies sent him a fat reimbursement check, and Ciarmoli smiled all the way to the bank. He submitted claims totaling nearly $750,000 between January 2016 and June 2018, out of which he was reimbursed $318,600. Throughout the first half of 2019, he brought in nearly $115,000 more by continuing the scam. But what about the rest of the money? If insurance only covered $300,000, who paid the rest? Those costs fell on the patients who were charged massive copays for procedures they didn't need. A crown installation is one of the most common dental procedures, but many patients don't know the ins and outs on when they actually need one versus when they don't. Ciarmoli exploited this uncertainty by convincing his patients that a crown was the only option to repair a problem that didn't actually exist. In broad terms, a crown, also known as a cap, is something that's installed over a damaged tooth to protect the crack or deterioration. In the long run, this dental solution can restore the tooth so it won't need to be extracted. This is a more dramatic move than a simple filling, and crowns are usually ordered when a simple filling won't do the trick. Caps are made of various materials, including resin, ceramic, porcelain, or certain types of metal, and they usually last for about a decade, give or take a few years. Of course, this solution doesn't come cheap. Based on the size of the crown and the amount of damage in the tooth, an individual cap can cost $1,500 or more. Although insurance can cover at least some of that cost, the patient is typically on the hook for roughly half of the bill, depending on what type of insurance the individual has. Even though many patients receive a crown each year, the sheer number of orders coming out of Ciarmoli's practice raised some red flags. However, those weren't the only red flags. Ciarmoli's former assistant, Bailey Bayer, testified that an increasingly steady flow of patients poured into the clinic. This became apparent after the dentist moved his practice into an even larger space. There was a huge hike in appointments made for crown installations. Bayer also explained that patients got a lower standard of care as time went on. Although she didn't have much experience when she started working for Ciarmoli, she could tell something was off about the way he ordered x-rays. Specifically, she said that the dentist procured such images after drilling into a patient's tooth, telling her that insurance will want to see this. At one point, Bayer said Ciarmoli was treating the procedure as a sales pitch, describing a work environment that became so unbearable that she eventually quit. Some of his patients grew skeptical of the dentist's medical advice. As Todd Tedeschi told jurors, he was talked into receiving 2 crowns during one visit, stressing that neither of the teeth in question had been hurting. But again, Ciarmoli was the professional, and Tedeschi trusted him. The lawyer, representing several former patients, argued that Ciarmoli relied on that trust to defraud his victims. Although the dentist's behavior was suspicious, he might have escaped criminal charges altogether if he hadn't sold his practice in 2019. Once the new owners combed through the records, they were shocked by the details they found. Then, when investigators learned of the inconsistencies, they dug even deeper. The amount of money Ciarmoli raked in through his scheme was staggering. In 2014 alone, he put in 434 crowns and made roughly $1.4 million. The next year, he installed more than twice as many caps and made about $2.5 million. The criminal investigation led to an indictment against Ciarmoli in 2020. Meanwhile, he faced over 100 lawsuits from patients similar to Tedeschi. Following the indictment, prosecutor Julie Stewart said her office was inundated with complaints from former patients. She explained that some of them were extremely vulnerable individuals in tough relationships, recently widowed, survivors of cancer, and living paycheck to paycheck, trying to afford the co-pays required for the unnecessary procedures he was billing. Paco Major, the new owner of Jackson Family Dentistry, addressed the controversy in a post on the clinic's official website. As a medical professional, he took an oath to do no harm to his patients, so he felt the ethical obligation permission to report activity that he believed to be suspicious. When Charmoli went to trial in March 2022, jurors heard enough to believe that the dentist was guilty of fraud. He faced 8 charges in total, and the jury voted to convict him on all but 1 count. Specifically, he was found guilty of 5 fraud counts and 2 counts of making false statements. He could spend 2 decades behind bars, but insiders predicted that he wouldn't receive the maximum prison term upon sentencing. In addition to the criminal conviction, he's still facing a slew of civil lawsuits, which received a stay from the court while the trial was underway. Unfortunately, Charmoli is just one of several dentists who faced criminal prosecution for fraud in recent years. Here are 3 more who ended up on the wrong side of the law. One Oregon dentist had his license suspended in 2020 after receiving millions in COVID-19 relief payments that he used to pay his personal bills. Reports indicate Salwan Ajaj had practices in several communities when he applied for federal financial aid. Prosecutors said that he completed dozens of such applications and filled them in with information about fake businesses and the names of people other than himself. Investigators didn't have to look too hard to find out where the money was going, since he used his own address on the forms. Although the government didn't actually pay him for most of the fraudulent claims, he had better luck when he started applying for relief through the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. Authorities say he invented several restaurants across Florida, and as with the dentistry-related applications, he entered his home address. In total, the Small Business Administration approved almost $8 million in payments based on the scam. He was arrested in late 2021 and was ordered to be held behind bars until he appeared in court again. Of course, this wasn't his first run-in with scandal. The State Dentistry Board issued a reprimand in 2015 after a judge skipped mandated sanitation tests at 2 of his clinics. About 5 years later, he was accused of illicitly ordering controlled substances that he used on himself and sold illegally without a prescription to other people. Authorities determined that Dr. Ajaj was under the influence while performing dental procedures for 4 years. Ajaj ultimately acknowledged what he was accused of, costing him his medical license. Sometimes it isn't the dentist, but the assistant. In 2021, Nevada police responded to a burglar alarm and discovered some cash was missing. Authorities determined that an employee of the dental clinic broke into the building and stole nearly $23,000. Investigators soon narrowed down their field of suspects and focused on Laurel Elsh. But stealing cash wasn't just the only thing. Elsh later confessed to removing 13 teeth from a patient even though she wasn't trained or licensed to perform such a procedure. She also admitted that she ingested an anesthetic meant for use at the clinic. Upon questioning, she confessed to a range of criminal acts. She was charged with felonies including burglary, grand larceny, and performing surgery without a license. Additionally, she faced a misdemeanor charge of conspiracy to commit burglary. Some people want to be a dentist, but don't want to go through all the training it takes to do it. That appeared to be the case for one Nevada woman accused of operating a dental clinic without a license to practice medicine. Authorities say Maria Loyo Morales brought in tens of thousands of dollars while posing as a dentist in Las Vegas. Security footage captured her performing dental procedures that she wasn't licensed to do. Furthermore, investigators believe she used household power tools instead of sophisticated dental equipment. Imagine going to the dentist and they whip out a power drill. The disturbing account of unsanitary conditions included one patient's complaint that a dog ran loose in the clinic while she underwent treatment. One individual told investigators that Loyo Morales picked up something from the floor and attempted to put it directly into a patient's mouth. Authorities say patients also registered complaints after they received services from Loyo Morales. Some of the most outrageous complaints involved poorly installed crowns and recycled dental implants. A police report described multiple patients who later complained that their faces had swollen extensively and the procedures resulted in discomfort. In response, Loyo Morales was accused of distributing antibiotics she illegally obtained from Mexico. Ultimately, prosecutors brought 8 felony counts against her, including performing surgery without a license and unlawful dentistry practice. More than 2 decades later, records show Loyo Morales received a court injunction preventing her from practicing dentistry without a license. A similar demand was handed down in 2009. The most recent probe began in 2019, stemming from allegations that she'd been dealing to patients. When one investigator responded to the illegal clinic, they found 2 patients hiding in the employee break room. Another patient's complaint involved a tooth extraction during which the supposed anesthesia he received didn't provide the intended effect. Furthermore, he told authorities that another dentist assured him that the tooth didn't need to be removed in the first place. Detectives tracked down several other patients after conducting a search warrant at the clinic, where they found documents and an array of dental equipment. As for how much Loya Morales made by posing as a dentist, authorities say one customer's bill was more than $24,000. Another individual reportedly paid her $5,000 in cash and a piece of land worth about $20,000. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comments section what you would rather do. Go to the dentist or do 30 minutes of cardio on the treadmill.